Hello and welcome. My name is Jeff McLynch, and I'm the project director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. I'm joined in our presentation today by John Tobin and Doug Hall, two members of the project's board of directors. We'd like to speak with you about two topics today, two topics that are deeply connected here in New Hampshire, and that really, in many ways, touch the lives of everyone in the Granite State: school funding and property taxes. These two topics are certainly of great importance to New Hampshire school children, represented here by this group of students from Berlin who put together this poster in their graphic arts class and participated in a local parade to call attention to the challenges that their schools have faced in recent years. These topics are important as well to New Hampshire's homeowners, renters, and businesses who, while they may support their local schools and recognize the value of investments in the state's shared future, still find it harder and harder to do so as property taxes place an ever greater strain on their budgets. In examining these two topics, we'll look at 5 areas in particular. First, we'll explore New Hampshire's constitutional responsibilities for school funding. We'll discuss the role of property taxes in funding schools and the inequities that arise as a result. We'll discuss the enormous gap between state aid and actual school costs. We'll examine some of the consequences and implications of New Hampshire's school funding system for the state as a whole. And finally, we'll examine how some of these issues may arise on the legislative agenda in the coming year. Now, that certainly seems like a lot of ground to cover, but we hope you'll take away 3 main points from our presentation this afternoon. First, that taxpayers and students are not treated equitably or fairly under the current system, that these inequities are only getting worse over time, and finally, that the system as a whole violates New Hampshire's Constitution. As John Tobin will delve into those constitutional issues now, I'll turn to him. John?
There are 2 provisions of the New Hampshire State Constitution that govern our state's school funding system. They both have been in the Constitution since it was written in 1784. The first says that our state is required to provide a constitutionally adequate education to every public school student K through 12 in the state. And in a minute, I will talk about what constitutionally adequate means. The hint is that it's not minimalist, it's broad. The second provision is that the taxes levied to meet this duty must be uniform in rate across the state. And you, during the course of this presentation, will be able to decide for yourselves whether the state is meeting either of these duties. And the New Hampshire Supreme Court in the Claremont cases has refined these duties and, in a sense, set an agenda for implementing them or operationalizing them. The court said that the state must define an adequate education, it must determine its costs, it must fund it with constitutional taxes, and it must create a system of accountability. First of all, what do we mean by constitutionally adequate education? It's a broad definition, it's an expansive definition, it's future-oriented. And the court explicitly said that mere competence in reading, writing, and arithmetic is not enough in the 21st century. Instead, the court is looking at exposing our kids to a broad range of the areas in school that they need in order to be successful competitors in the local economy, in the state economy, in the national economy, in the global economy. So it's things like technology, health, world languages. And the touchstone is we want our kids to succeed. We want them to have the skills and the knowledge to succeed in the 21st century. That's what the court means by constitutionally adequate education. So one of the things that the court said was that it recognized that this duty would play out differently in different districts, that what was needed in some districts is different than what's needed in others. For instance, in some rural districts, transportation is more of an issue. In some urban districts, English language learners. In many districts, poverty may be an issue. So the state is required to have a statewide standard, but it's also required to tailor its aid to fit the needs of local districts. And one of the things that the court said was the definition of adequacy and the obligation to fund it are completely connected. Whatever the state defines as adequate, it must pay for. And it can't take into account the local wealth or poverty of school districts or anything else. What is the state's duty is the state's duty in terms of paying for it. We get to the question of revenue, well, how to pay for it. And the court has really made clear that that's a legislative function. And in particular, the court was very explicit about the property tax. If the legislature decides that the property tax is the way to raise money or raise most of the money or some of the money. The tax rate has to be the same for that tax across the state. And that was one of the key holdings of the Claremont case and one of the holdings that the state has struggled to meet.
As John has explained, New Hampshire has long turned to property taxes to help fund its responsibilities to educate the children of the state and to prepare them for the future. That certainly remains true today. In fact, local property taxes are the single largest source of revenue for public education in New Hampshire. For the 2018-2019 school year, nearly $3.3 billion in revenue was directed to New Hampshire school districts. Local property taxes accounted for more than 70% of that total, over 7 out of every $10 raised that year. State aid comprised about 20% of the remainder in the form of adequacy aid, funds flowing from the lottery, and other forms of state assistance like school building aid. Federal aid made up a very small proportion of this total in 2019, really just about 5%. Just as local property taxes provide the bulk of funding for local school districts, property tax as a whole is the largest tax in New Hampshire. It is the driving force in our tax system today, whether it's for local schools, for cities and towns, for county government, or for, again, that portion of the tax known as swept. You see that it dwarfs every other source of revenue here in the state. Even the state's business taxes, which draw quite a bit of attention in public debates and in news media, those two taxes together, the business enterprise tax and the business profits tax, generate only about $800 million annually, well below what we turn to the property tax to produce. That reliance on property taxes to fund local education has only grown over the past decade. Here we see that revenues from local property taxation have grown by about $570 million over the past decade, well in excess of the growth in any state funding source and any federal funding source for local education. State adequacy aid has grown by about $34 million over the last 10 years or so, but that's offset by an actual decline in other state sources, chiefly to do with school building aid. And you might ask, well, why is it that the local property taxes play such a large role in New Hampshire? This chart here conveys that New Hampshire contributes less to its public schools than any other state in the nation. If you look to the right here, you see the states that provide the vast majority of funding for local schools. That includes places like Hawaii and Vermont, which provide at the state level over 80% of the revenues for local education. New Hampshire stands in stark contrast to that. For instance, if you were to include swept in that total, it's still less than 40%. But again, as we've discussed, swept is really just relabeled local taxation. And so in reality, the state as a whole provides just about 20% of that local revenue. Now, before going much further, it's worth explaining one concept or measure that we'll use throughout the presentation, and that's equalized value per pupil. And really what that measure seeks to do is to answer the question, how much property value is available in a town to be taxed to support each student's education? And it's important to do this on a per pupil basis so that you're making accurate comparisons. If you were to just take two communities at random and try to compare their property values, you would arrive at a different conclusion than if you were to try to take into account the students that need to be served by the property values in those communities. It comes down to a simple math problem. Let's imagine two communities right next to each other, one of which it might be a little more affluent and has higher property values. We're really simplifying matters here using nice round numbers that don't really reflect reality too much, but might help promote understanding. So in that property wealthy community, they have total property value of $1 million. The town next door is not quite as well off. Its property value is only total to $400,000. Now imagine that these two communities need to accomplish the same goal. They need to provide new science textbooks for third and fourth graders in their communities. And so they have to generate that money from the property tax. If they were to each impose a rate of $10 per thousand, given the differences in property value, they would generate substantially different sums of money. That more property wealthy community is going to generate $10,000 to pay for those textbooks. The less affluent community, the one with lower property values, is only going to generate about $4,000. If that bill were $10,000, they would have to impose a rate of $25 per thousand, 2.5 times that of the neighboring community, just to achieve the same result because of the differences in property values. Now, this simple math problem would not be a problem at all if the distribution of property value and the distribution of students were approximately the same. And not to give away the story here or to ruin the punchline, but they are not. This table here makes that abundantly clear. What we've done is shown a wide dispersion of communities throughout New Hampshire and looked at how many pupils are in those communities, what their total property value is, and what their equalized value per pupil might be. Smack in the middle there is the state of New Hampshire as a whole. For 2018, 2019, it was serving about 174,000 students throughout its public schools, and property values all told throughout the state on an equalized basis were about $194 billion. When you do the math, that works out to just over $1.1 million per pupil in the state in equalized value that year. As you can see, there's a wide dispersion of equalized values per pupil throughout the state. At the very top, you have Moultonborough, and by at the very top, I just mean on this table. There are actually communities that have equalized value per pupil, even in excess of Moultonborough. But Moultonborough had 469 students within its public schools that year. Its equalized value throughout the town was about $3.3 billion, which works out to just over $7 million of equalized value for each pupil in that community. As a result, they were able to use a much lower property tax rate than in a lot of places, just $3.79 per thousand. Contrast that with a place like Newport. Newport was serving more students, but its equalized value for the town as a whole was considerably less. So on an equalized value per pupil basis, they only had about $500,000. That means that they need to rely on much higher property tax rates, close to $15 per thousand for this year. Even with those much higher rates, they generated substantially less on a per pupil basis, just about $8,300 per kid. So compare those two communities. Newport has a tax rate that's nearly 4 times as high as Moultonborough, but generates about a third of the amount of revenue to serve each student. Just tremendous disparities across the state due to those variations in property values. And in the next slide, we'll see that those disparities have only grown over time. This looks back over the last 10 years and looks at how equalized property value may have changed in different places throughout New Hampshire. On the left-hand side, you have communities like Portsmouth and Hanover, where property values have really skyrocketed in the last 10 years. In the case of Portsmouth, by about 40%, well in excess of the overall state rate, which is shown in the middle. To the right, if you look there, what you see are communities like Pittsfield and Claremont, where property values have actually declined sharply over the last 10 years. What does this mean on a practical basis? Well, let's look at Pittsfield. In Pittsfield, they've gone to great lengths to keep their school budget steady over this period. But even just treading water in that way means that because of declining property values, they need to have rising tax rates just to tread water, just to keep their heads above water.
We can think just for a moment about the consequences of that in terms of teacher salary, teacher turnover, technology, materials. There's an enormous gap in the spending. At the same time, the tax rates are much higher. This is looking at school districts with comparable numbers of students. In some ways, this gets to the question, well, isn't this about economies of scale? It's really not about economies of scale. Compare Milford and Portsmouth, almost exactly the same number of kids, but the equalized value in Portsmouth is more than 3 times higher than that in Milford. So again, once again, Milford has a much higher tax rate. The tax on that $200,000 home is more a year. The tax on a business, a $10 million business, is $120,000 more per year. So you have a situation where school districts of the same size, but with different tax bases, end up with different tax rates and different spending. Pittsfield and Rye is another example, 2 small school districts. Pittsfield's equalized value per pupil is only about 1/10 of Rye's. So the tax rate in Rye is only a little more than 1/4 what it is in Pittsfield. Tax bills are much higher in Pittsfield on businesses and homes, while at the same time the spending is much lower. So you can see that however way you slice New Hampshire school districts, the inequities are stark. This is another way of looking at it, and this is taking real estate listings from 2020 in 2 different towns in New Hampshire. And you can see on the left, a lovely colonial home, on the right, an older mobile home. Which of these homes has the larger tax bill? Next slide shows that in fact, the beautiful colonial home in fact pays lower taxes in Newington than the taxes paid on that mobile home in Charlestown, New Hampshire, where the market price and the assessed value are about 1/10. And why is this? Because Newington is property wealthy, they can have a very low tax rate. Charlestown is property poor. What property there is has to be taxed at a higher rate. Can anyone say that this is fair? Does this make sense? This is a slide that talks about how this works across the state. And this slide came from a question that we got at one of our presentations. And the question was, what's the percentage of kids in New Hampshire and taxpayers that are affected by these discrepancies in property values and tax rates? And Doug Hall, our colleague who's part of this team in this presentation, figured out that more than 3/4 of the students in our state and a comparable number of taxpayers live in school districts with below average property values. Only 1/4 of the taxpayers and students live in districts with above average property values. So that means that for 3/4 of the school districts, and those districts include all the cities in the state except Portsmouth and Lebanon. So Manchester, Nashua, Keene, Concord are all in the have-not end of this. That means that the taxpayers in all of those places have to run faster and sweat more. They have to pay higher rates, but those districts can spend less.
We want to delve in a little more depth into how state aid is currently calculated and how that might compare to the actual needs of local school districts.
This table explains how the state calculated the cost of an adequate education for every district in the state in the school year that just ended. I'm going to use Derry as the example. The state said that each pupil's cost would be $3,709, so they multiplied that by the $4,749 of Derry students. But the state also acknowledged that low-income children cost more to educate than others, and assigned the additional value of $1,854 to each of Derry's 1,148 children who are receiving free or reduced price meals. Also, in special education, added another $1,995 for Derry's just over 1,000 special education students. Derry had 63 English language learners, and each of those were assigned $726 extra dollars. And there were a few students in third grade who were below proficient in English, and those 77 were also assigned an additional $726. So the result was that the state said an adequate education should cost just $21.8 million in Derry, which is, on average, $4,604 per pupil. But in fact, Derry was spending $15,336 per pupil. And you can see on other districts we've illustrated here that the difference is about the same, where the state is saying that the cost of an adequate education is about 1/3 of what the actual cost is in those districts. To determine what it would mean to operate a district at what the state said is the cost of an adequate education, I worked with the superintendent and the business manager in Pittsfield with their budget. 581 students in Pittsfield, the state said that should cost $2.6 million or $4,630 per student in 2018-19. The Pittsfield School District budget for that year was $10.3 million or $17,700 per student. So what we did was we decided we would pare that budget down to bring it down to what the state said would be an adequate education. And in doing that, we decided we would preserve all of the core classrooms from kindergarten through 12th grade, and within their 700-line budget, we began to pare things down. So this is what we began to do. I'm not going to read all of these. We eliminated field trips, athletic programs, all art, music, and gym classes, all buildings and ground maintenance, all foreign language courses. We eliminated 5 teachers at the elementary school. We eliminated field trips and all athletic programs. We eliminated all bus services. We eliminated health insurance and all other benefits for the teachers. 3 special education teachers, all new technology equipment, the reading specialist. We eliminated all substitute teachers, all guidance personnel, all librarians, all media center staff. Now, having made all those reductions, we had succeeded in keeping average class size to 29 students, and core classes remained. So had we met the state's goal? We had not met the state's goal. At that point, $5.289 million was the budget for Pittsfield, and class sizes were 29 students per teacher. To cut down to the state's adequacy level meant to cut that yet in half. Since everything else had been essentially eliminated, the only thing we could do was to eliminate nearly half of the remaining teachers. At that point, class sizes were 60 students per teacher, and all those ancillary services had been eliminated. How does anyone believe that this will provide an adequate education for the 581 students in Pittsfield? The state does.
So how do these differences play out in real-life consequences? The differences in the ability of local districts to raise money because the state provides so little. One way to look at this is teacher salaries. And these are 2 charts about starting teacher salaries. The top chart is about the brand new teachers just out of UNH with a BA. What do they get in a first year salary? And compare Portsmouth and Pittsfield. Portsmouth, $44,000, Pittsfield, $30,000. So the people in Portsmouth right out of school get a salary that's 50% higher than those in Pittsfield. This is something that has gotten worse in the last few years, as the next slide shows. If you look at the year 2007, 2008, there was a gap between salaries in Rye and salaries in Pittsfield. Move forward a decade, you can see the gap is even bigger. What does that mean in terms of teacher turnover? In Pittsfield, sometimes they have a third of their teachers leave each year. They hire the new teachers, they train them, and then they go up the road 10 miles or 20 miles, make a whole lot more money, and the Pittsfield districts have to start all over again. So there are enormous consequences to this. In addition to the harm that the system causes to students and taxpayers, there are broader implications about the way this system impacts life and prosperity in New Hampshire. One of the basic things that everyone can agree on, whether you're liberal, conservative, Republican, or Democrat, is that our state government should foster economic development and prosperity across the state. It shouldn't play favorites among communities. Well, in fact, this school funding system doesn't do that. It discourages economic development. It works against even economic stability in the property-poor towns. And one of the ways you can understand that readily is to think about why would a rational business person open a new business in Berlin or Charlestown, where the tax rates on his or her home, on their business property, will be much, much higher, but the school system where their kids go and their employees' kids go will be shaky. So this system does not encourage broad economic development. Related to that is the changes in our demographics here. We now recognize that we have an aging population. And so everyone across the political spectrum agrees that we need to attract and keep young families. But let's ask the question, does this system help us do that? In fact, it doesn't help us do that. So once again, we have a system that works against a policy goal that all of us share. Another thing that this system does is it discourages cooperation regionally. It discourages reaching for economies of scale. This is a slide about a regional school district. These 4 towns are part of the Timberlane School District, but look at the difference in equalized value and the difference in tax rates and the difference in taxes on their homes. A kid in Danville sitting next to a kid from Atkinson, 2 girls in biology class, they're getting the same education, but the girl from Danville's parents are paying much more in property taxes than the parents of the kid from Atkinson. And what this system has tended to do is to encourage the wealthier towns to leave these mixed school districts in order to stop, in their view, having to subsidize the poorer towns. In a time of declining school enrollments, the notion of regionalizing, combining makes more sense than ever. The economies of it are clearer and clearer, but this system discourages that. As the mayor of Berlin said, why would anyone take us? Why would a wealthier town under the current system agree to regionalize with Berlin? So once again, we have an actual system that works against something we all think the government should be doing, which is encouraging efficiency and regionalization.
Finally, we do want to spend a little time considering how the shortcomings inherent in New Hampshire's current school funding system might be addressed when the next legislature convenes. Most immediately, policymakers, as they craft the next version of the state budget, will need to decide whether to preserve the modest progress that has been made in providing additional resources to local school districts. More specifically, the state's current budget for the fiscal 2020-2021 biennium provides over $120 million in additional aid to local districts via 3 changes in law. The additional state aid included in the current budget helped to ease mounting pressure on local budgets and, more to the point, on local property taxpayers. Consequently, any failure to preserve or extend this recent progress would simply shift costs back onto those local taxpayers. Now, the same budget agreement that directed additional resources to local school districts in the short term also took a longer-term view toward addressing the inequities that plague New Hampshire's school funding system. That is to say, that it established an independent 16-member commission to study school funding in New Hampshire and charged it with, among other things, making recommendations to ensure a uniform and equitable design for financing the cost of an adequate education for all public school students in the state. Secondly, it's been asked to determine whether the New Hampshire school funding formula complies with court decisions mandating the opportunity for an adequate education, and this bears some emphasis, with a revenue source that is uniform across the state. Now, the Commission to Study School Funding is slated to issue specific legislative recommendations by December 1st of 2020. Consequently, the Commission's work holds great potential to shape a good deal of next year's legislative agenda. And finally, the Commission's recommendations may dovetail with one other development related to school funding and property taxes. A variety of cases decided by New Hampshire's Supreme Court have established and clarified the state of New Hampshire's responsibility to provide an adequate education for every child, regardless of where he or she may live. The Supreme Court may soon rule on a new case that could affirm that responsibility and spur the legislature to act. More specifically, in March of 2019, 4 school districts, Kentucky Valley or Conval, Winchester, Massenic, and Monadnock, collectively filed suit against the state of New Hampshire, alleging that the existing school funding system fails to comply with the Constitution and the Claremont decisions that we described earlier. The Cheshire County Superior Court ruled in favor of those districts in June of 2019, holding that the state was indeed in violation of the Constitution. Not surprisingly, the state has appealed, and the Supreme Court in September of 2019 accepted that appeal. In the intervening year or so, several amicus briefs have been filed, including one from 26 school districts and the New Hampshire School Boards Association, which really demonstrates the wide breadth of support for action by the legislature on this topic. The Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in the case in September. And it may well be that the Supreme Court decides the Conval case prior to the start of the next legislature, or at the very least, early in its term. If that were to transpire, the legislature would not only have a mandate to act, but would have a plan for action already in place in the form of the Commission's recommendations. In short, 2021 could well be a critical year in the drive to achieve greater fairness for New Hampshire students and taxpayers alike.
So, from all of this, I think you can see that we have a really inequitable and unfair and irrational system. And I think we could all agree that in New Hampshire, a student's educational opportunities and a taxpayer's tax rate should not depend so randomly and arbitrarily on their zip code. This is a little bit of information about our project, the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. Our mission is to do what we're doing right now, informing people about how the system works. We also advocate for change in the legislature, and we get involved in lawsuits if necessary to push that change along. We have great constitutional principles. We need to bring them to life. You can reach us by phone, by email, on the web, and through Twitter. and we encourage you to contact us. We are interested in making these presentations around the state, so please reach out to us, and thank you very much.